All right, guys, today we are going to separate skirt layers, and we're gonna have two tools that you need. You need a seam ripper. They're tiny, they're cheap. You can get sets of like 5 for less than $10, and you need little snipper scissors. Super sharp fabric scissors, so don't let the kids or the husbands play with them or cut anything else. And watch out because they're super sharp. You don't wanna lay your fabrics on them or they poke holes. Take it from me, it may have happened before. So you need these two tools to be able to separate your skirts the best way. And I've already partially separated this skirt on one end, so you don't have to watch me for like 45 minutes try to separate it. It's really not that long. But what we're gonna do is take the seam ripper, and you're going to, every like 5th or so stitch, you'll carefully take the seam ripper and then pull it through that stitch. You don't have to do every stitch. Every 5 to 8 or so across the skirt. I start at one end and go all the way to the other. But today we're just gonna go to the buttonhole because I've already done the other half, or 2/3 technically, since there's 3 buttonholes on this particular skirt. And I like to do this while I'm watching a show or having a chat with a friend. As long as you don't need to use your hands for the other activity, this is pretty easy to do. You don't have to have a lot of focus. You don't want to be super distracted because occasionally the seam ripper, he's kind of sharp and might go all the way through your fabric. So if you have to watch the subtitles on your TV show, it might not be the best option. So we're going to come here to this buttonhole, and I will tell you, when you get there in the future, you might want to do the 3 or 4 stitches closest to each side of the buttonhole because it's really tight right there. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. So you do one side of the skirt and then you go to the other side. And outside the skirt, you don't need to do this seam on the belt. You can keep that completely stitched, and you only do the seam closest to the fabrics. The top part of the belt, you don't want to unstitch that. That's going to keep the belt in its form a little bit better. And sometimes it's even after you unstitch the belt, you may want to iron it in the shape, and like you would fold the belt and then iron it in the shape you want it on your skirt. Sometimes they can get a little bit bent out of shape, for lack of a better word. So that can be helpful. Or if the belt seems to have some funky stitching, you can iron it and then put a dart in it to straighten it out. So again, just every like 5 to 10 stitches. So it's great to separate layers if you have a skirt that has some super funky, odd, mismatched layers. Maybe you're trying to sell a skirt and it's having trouble selling. You can totally separate the layers and sell them separately. There's a whole Facebook group for that. I think it's called the Sorry Skirt Layer Exchange. So you can totally do that. Sometimes people will keep the skirt together until the layers sell and then separate them. Sometimes we want to frankenskirt our own skirt, so we want to match them with different layers, and we will do that. We'll separate them, and then there's people that have several layers for sale. Okay, so now that we've got the stitches ripped on both sides off the belt, we're going to come over here to the edge, and when you're close to the edge, you really want to do like the closest 4 or 5 again stitches. Because you want to be able to pull this apart here. But you don't want to rip it. So you really just have to take these stitches out. I will say, they really reinforce the edges of the skirts, which is great. But it does make it harder to get these stitches out. So I've got the waistband pulled off here. So now you can see the stitches that go along the edge of the top layer, the top of both layers together. So these are always a little harder to get out. I feel like these stitches are a little tighter. Sometimes they will go back and forth. This skirt didn't, but they'll go forward and back to reinforce the stitches here so that they don't come undone, which is so great. But that means sometimes you have a couple of layers of stitches to seam rip. Okay, and then we're gonna go, there we go, perfect. It's coming apart nicely. And you can see right on the edge, it gets a little caught. Sometimes you can just pull it out. Sometimes you need the seam ripper to pull it out the rest of the way. So now that we have it off the edge, I just take it in one hand, so thumb and pointer, and then middle and ring finger, to pull the layers apart so I can easily get to that seam that's down the middle of both layers. Then you just kind of keep going. Every few stitches, you'll have to move your fingers or so, but this part goes pretty fast. This is also where sometimes you might accidentally get the skirt with your seam ripper, so just be careful. Keep the belt away from your poker. And you just gently pull out those seams. Sometimes you'll get a couple and then you just pull the layers apart and it'll come, you know, like an inch or two, which is kind of nice. Because you've already cut this, sometimes you've already pulled some of this seam out. Some of them, the stitches are closer together. Some of them, the stitches are further apart, so it can be a little easier or more challenging. You do need good light for this and also a comfortable place to sit. I do notice sometimes I'll be leaning because I have trouble seeing and I have to turn on the bright lights. The sunlight coming through the window dims too much. Okay, so we're gonna make it all the way, oh, not there yet, all the way to that buttonhole. So I'd like to take credit for all this knowledge, but I was taught by my wonderful mother-in-law. She is amazing. She quilts and sews and does all kinds of amazing things where I do not normally. So she's the one that taught me how to frankenskirt, and she is making sure I'm saying all the right things today on this video, and she's also going to help me when I show how to put the skirt back together, but with different layers. So I cannot take credit for this knowledge. Some people prefer to have layers that perfectly line up. Some people are okay with having an inch or so on either side. We'll show you that on the putting the skirt back together video. I need a better name for that. We'll probably just call it part 2. This is part 1. You got to take the skirt apart. All right. Okay, so now I'm at the buttonhole, and I've done as far as I can go. There aren't stitches. This stitch there is actually the buttonhole stitched to the layer. You do not want to unstitch the buttonholes. Okay, that is going to be super hard to fix. Hardly anyone does that. But it is sewn. The buttonholes are sewn onto both layers. So you want to leave the belt on typically with the layer it matches. So those snippers that I had shown you earlier, that's where these come in. So you're going to very carefully cut just the long layer away from the buttonhole or the non-matching layer. You don't want to cut the whole layer off. Some people would say, oh, well, isn't that just easier to do, to just cut the whole layer off? Yeah, it's easier, but then your skirt's not the right size or length any longer. And there's a lot of fraying that can happen at the top of the skirt. So you don't want to cut, you want to de-stitch. So with your snippers, I'm taking the matching layer in my fingers and kind of pulling it relatively tight, but close together to the belt. And then I kind of have like a U with this other layer. And I'm gonna cut a little U shape. These are actually curved. I don't know if you can see that, but these are actually curved, so you can kind of cut the layer curved around the buttonhole. Be careful not to cut through the buttonhole. So just very carefully, we take it around. And I use my bottom finger to kind of guide it, but be careful to not cut yourself on the bottom finger. Go slow. These are very, very sharp. All right, so now we have that little U shape there. It's a little inconvenient, but it's a lot less inconvenient than de-stitching the buttonhole, and you can easily stitch this back into your frankenskirt. And now our layers are separated. I do want to show one more of the buttonholes just so we're very clear on it. Do the little U shape very carefully. I have one more. Okay, this one has 3. So, but then your layers are separated and you can make a new skirt. And voila. So we have layer 1, the belt still attached at the buttonholes only, totally normal. This is how most of the frankenskirters do it. So they're attached there where they're supposed to be. The other really helpful thing about that and not cutting it off is that you can pair your layers up evenly with the buttonholes. So that's a really nice trick or help. Sometimes when you're de-stitching, occasionally the belt is not attached at all, and it makes it slightly more complicated. You have to do some measuring and folding and make sure that buttonhole lines up in the middle there. So this skirt had 3, which is nice, and we are all separated there. And then the long layer is just one piece. It's all completely separated, nice across the top there, and we just have our little U's where the belt was. So hopefully that was a helpful video. Now you know how to take a skirt apart, and that's a wrap.